The notice appeared on my front door early on a Monday morning, placed with an almost ceremonial precision that suggested the person who left it wanted to make a point. The paper was bright orange, aggressive in its coloring, and impossible to overlook. It fluttered slightly in the soft breeze, catching my attention before I had even stepped fully onto the porch. There was an official seal at the top, the unmistakable emblem of the Homeowners Association, positioned like a stamp of unquestionable authority. The bold text beneath it made my stomach tighten even before I read the details. It was a violation. A hefty one. A daily fine for an offense I had not committed. According to the notice, my property was in violation of HOA regulations due to the presence of an unregistered dog, specifically one that was causing repeated noise disturbances throughout the night. The fine was $75 per day, retroactively applied for the last 3 nights, totaling an amount that felt like a punch to the gut. As I stood on the porch, the early morning sunlight casting a long shadow across my yard, confusion turned to disbelief. I had no dog. I had never owned a dog. My property had been quiet, calm, and uneventful for years. The idea that I was suddenly responsible for a barking animal I had never even seen was so illogical that it took several moments for the situation to fully settle into my mind. The HOA in my neighborhood was notorious for its rigid enforcement of rules, often surpassing what many residents considered reasonable. It wasn't uncommon to find warnings for grass being a half-inch too long or complaints about trash bins left visible for an extra hour after pickup. Still, even with their reputation for nitpicking, this particular violation felt more targeted somehow, as if someone had gone out of their way to ensure I received it. The retroactive fines especially felt suspicious, as though the decision had been made before any investigation was conducted. The absence of evidence or photographic documentation made it even more inexplicable. As the day progressed, the situation grew more unsettling. When I reviewed recent events, there had been nothing unusual happening near my home. No suspicious noises, no stray animals, no disturbances of any kind. The quiet of my evenings had been the same as always. I tried to reason through possible explanations. Perhaps a neighbor's dog had been mistaken as mine. Perhaps the HOA had mixed up addresses. Or maybe they were relying on anonymous reports from someone who had targeted me without cause. None of these explanations felt satisfactory, and the more I thought about it, the stronger the sense of intentionality became. Late in the afternoon, as the neighborhood settled into its usual serene rhythm, I began noticing subtle signs that something was off. A neighbor across the street watched me for an unusually long time as he watered his lawn, almost as if waiting to see my reaction to the day's events. Another neighbor, who normally greeted me whenever we passed each other, avoided eye contact entirely. There was a strange shift in the atmosphere, quiet, almost conspiratorial. It felt as though the entire street knew something I didn't, or at least believed something about me that wasn't true. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my property, checking every inch of the fence line for any gaps or signs of intrusion. Everything was secure. There were no paw prints in the damp soil, no shredded areas on the wood panels, no tufts of fur caught in the edges. The absence of physical evidence only deepened my frustration. If a dog had been coming onto my property, surely there would be some trace left behind. But there was nothing. It was as if the entire accusation had materialized out of thin air. The next morning, another violation notice appeared. This one was taped to my door at a slightly crooked angle, almost as if it had been placed in haste. The fine had increased. Another $75 added to the total. The notice stated that the disturbances had continued through the previous night, yet I had heard nothing. The silence had been unbroken, undisturbed. The idea that the HOA could fabricate repeated offenses without any form of verification unsettled me more than I cared to admit. It felt like standing on shifting ground, unsure of when the next blow might come. Determined to understand what was happening, I decided to conduct my own investigation. My first step was installing a pair of security cameras along the sides of my house, angled to capture the front yard, driveway, and the outer edges of the backyard. I placed them deliberately, ensuring they had an unobstructed view of any potential entry points. I wanted undeniable proof of what was or wasn't occurring on my property. The installation process took longer than expected, but by the time night fell, I felt more prepared than I had the day before. As the cameras recorded the quiet darkness of the night, I found myself unable to sleep. There was a lingering tension, a sense of being watched or judged by unseen eyes. The idea that I was being falsely accused gnawed at me. I couldn't understand why anyone would target me. I kept to myself. I paid my dues. I followed the rules. Yet someone, somewhere within this neighborhood, had decided that I was guilty of something that had never even happened. When I checked the camera footage the next morning, I expected to find nothing at all. Instead, I found something that made my heart sink. At around 2 in the morning, a medium-sized dog appeared on the screen, emerging through a narrow gap in the fence shared with my back neighbor. The dog barked repeatedly, pacing along the fence before disappearing the same way it came. The timestamps matched the supposed disturbances listed on the violation notices. There was no doubt anymore. A dog had been on my property. But it wasn't mine. And the gap in the fence belonged to someone else. The neighbor's dog had been wandering into my yard at night without my knowledge. The realization hit with a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that the mystery finally had an explanation. Anger that the HOA had blamed me without even the slightest attempt at investigation. Yet even as I processed this new information, something about the footage felt strange. The dog seemed too familiar with the route, moving with confidence and purpose. Almost as if it had done this many times before. And more importantly, someone had to have known this dog wasn't mine. Someone had chosen to blame me anyway, and that realization changed everything. The discovery of the dog slipping through the fence should have resolved the situation, but instead it opened the door to something far more unsettling. The clarity provided by the footage only reinforced how deliberate the HOA's actions had been. The fine notices had not been mistakes. They had been issued with confidence, as though the person responsible knew that any evidence would point back toward my property. What they didn't anticipate was that I would install cameras or question their decisions. Most residents never did. Most simply paid the fines, grumbling quietly but complying nonetheless. But now I had undeniable proof that the accusations were baseless, and a growing suspicion told me that the HOA might be counting on most people not investigating at all. The next step was to study the behavior of the dog more closely. For the next 2 nights, I kept the cameras running, observing the pattern. Almost like clockwork, the dog slipped through the same gap in the fence at almost the same time each night. It barked near my back porch for several minutes before retreating. The repetition felt strange, nearly orchestrated, and the thought that this might be intentional had begun settling heavily in my mind. The dog belonged to someone nearby, someone who allowed it to roam despite clear HOA policies about containment. And yet, I was the one being fined for its behavior. The following morning, I reviewed the HOA violation portal. Buried beneath layers of poorly designed navigation and minimal transparency, each complaint filed against me included the same cryptic signature, Admin Number 1. The designation was vague, offering no clue as to who was responsible. But it raised an immediate red flag. Most HOA systems identified board members by their names or titles. An anonymous administrative identifier suggested an intentional attempt to conceal the identity of the complainant. Curiosity turned into determination. I began researching the HOA structure, combing through public records, newsletters, meeting minutes, and member rosters. The president, a woman who had led the association for years, had developed a reputation for being excessively strict and unforgiving. Residents often whispered about her heavy-handed tactics, though few dared to challenge her openly. The control she exercised over the community was almost absolute, and it wasn't uncommon to hear of residents paying fines simply to avoid conflict or retaliation. As I studied the violator logs for other residents, information that was technically accessible only because of a poorly designed website, I noticed a pattern. Multiple households had received noise-related pet violations, all tied to the same admin number 1 account. Each fine was issued late at night or early in the morning, presumably when residents were less likely to be awake and able to witness anything unusual. These violations were frequent, excessive, and suspiciously uniform in wording. The fines added up to thousands of dollars across the neighborhood. And some residents had paid without question. The realization hit me with a cold rush. This was more than negligence or pettiness. It was consistent, calculated exploitation. Someone had turned the HOA into a mechanism for extracting money through fabricated violations. The dog wandering into my yard had likely been the same dog used to justify complaints against others. Perhaps it had become a convenient tool, its late-night movements weaponized into false accusations. And the president, with her iron grip on the board, was at the center of it all, determined to expose the truth. I expanded the scope of my investigation. I repositioned my cameras to capture movement near the fence as well as the adjoining properties. Within 2 more nights, the footage revealed something unmistakable. The HOA president herself appeared near the fence line, leading the dog toward the gap before retreating into the shadows. The dog slipped through again, barking in the same predictable pattern. The president had been using the dog intentionally, guiding it to create the appearance of disturbances, and then filing fines as though the noise originated from the targeted resident. The evidence was damning. Not only did I have recordings of the dog entering my property, but now I had footage of the president manipulating the situation. My suspicion about the anonymous admin number 1 account suddenly felt more than justified. The scam was systematic. It was organized. And it had likely been happening for years. Rather than confronting her directly, I understood that the situation required precision. I collected every piece of evidence, videos, logs, timestamps, screenshots of repeated fines issued under the same anonymous account, and copies of all violation notices. I organized everything meticulously, ensuring that nothing appeared ambiguous or incomplete. My aim was not just to clear my own name but to dismantle the entire scheme and protect others who had unknowingly fallen victim to it. Once I felt confident that the evidence was irrefutable, I prepared a detailed report. The packet included a chronological timeline of events, a breakdown of suspicious fines across the neighborhood, and a comparison of pet-related violations before and after the president took office. The evidence painted a clear, undeniable picture. The HOA president had orchestrated a long-term scam using fabricated complaints to generate income from residents. And she had grown comfortable enough in her position to believe she would never be caught. Rather than submitting the report quietly, I made sure it reached the right people simultaneously. The entire HOA board received a copy. So did the city compliance department, the county records office, the local news station's investigative reporter, and every resident in the neighborhood association. I sent the message at sunrise, ensuring that it would be the first thing everyone encountered that morning. The neighborhood erupted. Word spread quickly as residents read through the report, realizing they too had been targeted with baseless fines. Many had paid without questioning the accusations. Others had lived with anger and frustration, believing themselves unlucky targets of strict enforcement. Now they knew the truth, that the president had manipulated the system for personal gain, using anonymous administrative privileges and a predictable canine accomplice. By midday, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting. The president attempted to defend herself, but the evidence was overwhelming. Video footage captured her leading the dog toward my yard. Logs showed her issuing fines under the admin number 1 account. Testimonies from residents revealed consistent patterns of questionable enforcement. There was no room for explanation, no context that could soften the reality of her misconduct. The board voted unanimously to remove her from her position effective immediately. A full audit was launched, revealing the financial discrepancies and confirming that thousands of dollars had been collected through fraudulent means. Legal action followed swiftly, and the former president found herself facing charges for embezzlement, fraud, and property misconduct. Her fall from power was swift, public, and absolute. As for the neighborhood, the atmosphere shifted in the weeks that followed. The fines stopped. Transparency increased. A new board was established, made up of residents committed to fairness rather than control. The dog that had unknowingly served as the catalyst for the scam was safely returned to its owner, who had been entirely unaware of how it had been used. With the scam exposed and the president removed, the neighborhood finally began to heal. And the orange violation notices that once symbolized intimidation and manipulation disappeared from doors entirely. The HOA had learned its lesson. And so had I. The truth, once uncovered, had the power to dismantle even the strongest illusions.